The studio lights were blindingly bright, burning with a white-hot intensity that made everything else in the room fade into shadow. It was the kind of atmosphere that usually crackled with high energy, filled with the sounds of a live band and the roar of a crowd ready to be entertained. But tonight, inside the walls of one of the most popular late-night television studios, the mood felt different. It felt heavier, somehow more significant. As the cameras zoomed in on the guest sitting on the velvet couch, Keanu Reeves adjusted his suit jacket nervously. To the millions of people watching at home, he was a superhero. He was the man who could dodge bullets, fight off armies in suits, and survive impossible battles on the big screen. He was an icon of action and strength. But sitting there, under the harsh glare of the studio lights, he didn't look like an action star. He looked like a regular guy who was trying to find the right words to say. He had a gentle posture, his shoulders slightly slumped, and a face that showed the wear and tear of real life. Not the makeup of a movie set. The host of the show, a man with a loud voice and an even louder personality, leaned forward with a big smile. He started by asking the usual questions. He wanted to know about the new blockbuster movie, the explosions, and the stunts. Keanu answered politely. He nodded and smiled, giving the audience the funny stories they wanted to hear about filming on location and the crazy things that happened on set. The audience laughed at the right times, just like they were supposed to. But there was a feeling in the room that the conversation was just skimming the surface. It felt like they were talking about a character, not the man actually sitting there. Then, the tone of the interview shifted. The host decided to move away from the movie scripts and ask about Keanu's real life. He asked a question that many interviewers are afraid to touch. He asked how Keanu manages to stay so grounded and happy despite the incredible tragedies he has faced in his personal life. The room went silent. You could almost hear a pin drop as the audience waited for his answer. Keanu didn't dodge the question. He didn't give a fake PR answer or a quick joke to change the subject. He took a deep breath and looked directly at the host. His eyes were honest and open. He began to speak not as a movie star but as a human being who has known deep pain. He talked about the darkness that can engulf a person when they lose the people they love most. He spoke softly about the passing of his best friend, the heartbreak of losing his child, and the sorrow of losing his partner. These weren't headlines to him. They were scars he carried every single day. As he spoke, the cynical veneer of the television show seemed to melt away. Keanu explained that after going through such grief, the world looks different. He said that when you have lost so much, you realize that the only things that really matter are love and kindness. He told the quiet room that he held onto a faith not necessarily in a specific religion, but a faith in the universe and a belief that things will get better. He said that even when life is hard, you have to keep moving forward. You have to hold on to the good. The audience listened in a hushed reverence. It was rare to see a celebrity strip away their fame and stand so vulnerable in front of millions of people. He wasn't asking for pity. He was just sharing his truth. He spoke about how he tries to treat everyone with respect because he knows how heavy life can be for everyone, not just for him. He talked about the simple joy of a good meal or a quiet moment, and how those small things are actually the big things. It was a beautiful moment of connection. The cameras seemed to disappear, and for a while, it was just a group of people listening to a wise man talk about life, pain, and hope. Keanu's voice was calm and steady, radiating a kind of peace that you don't often see on TV. He truly believed what he was saying. You could see it in his face. He believed that despite all the bad things in the world, there is light if you choose to see it. However, while the audience and the main host seemed moved by his words, the atmosphere on the couch was about to change. Sitting next to Keanu was the guest host for the night. This man was known for his sharp tongue, his roasting of celebrities, and a kind of humor that relied on making fun of people. While Keanu was pouring his heart out, the guest host was shifting in his seat. He had a look on his face that wasn't sympathetic. It looked like he was getting annoyed. He seemed to think that Keanu's deep thoughts and faith were boring. To him it sounded like weakness. He sat there with his arms crossed, a tight smirk playing on his lips, waiting for his turn to speak. He didn't like the silence, and he certainly didn't like the sincerity. He was just seconds away from turning this touching moment into something else entirely. The silence that filled the studio after Keanu finished speaking was heavy and peaceful. It was the kind of silence that happens when people hear something true and real, something that touches their hearts. The main host nodded slowly, looking at Keanu with a new level of respect. He seemed to be searching for the right words to say, something that could honor what had just been shared. The cameras were rolling, capturing the moment, but for a second it felt like the television cameras weren't even there. It was just three men sitting on a stage talking about life, but then the spell was broken. The man sitting on the other side of Keanu, the guest host for the night, decided he had waited long enough. This man was known for his loud comedy and his sharp tongue. He didn't like quiet moments. He didn't like deep talks about feelings. To him, television was about noise, jokes, and making people laugh, even if it was at someone else's expense. He sat there with a bored look on his face, tapping his pen against his coffee mug. He clearly thought that Keanu's words about faith and kindness were boring. He thought they were too heavy for a fun show. Suddenly, a loud, sharp laugh exploded from his side of the couch. It was a jarring sound like a glass breaking in a quiet library. The laugh didn't seem to be a reaction to anything funny. It felt forced and aggressive. It cut through the respectful silence like a knife, causing the audience to jump slightly in their seats. The main host looked over, surprised, but the guest host didn't stop. He leaned forward, a sarcastic grin plastered across his face, and turned his body directly toward Keanu. "Come on, seriously?" the guest host said, his voice dripping with disbelief. He waved his hand dismissively in the air, as if he was trying to wave away a bad smell. "We are really doing this? The nice guy routine again?" Keanu turned his head slowly, looking at the man. His face didn't show anger. He just looked confused. He didn't understand why his honest feelings were being treated like a joke. The guest host saw Keanu's calm reaction and seemed to take it as a challenge. He wanted to get a rise out of him. He wanted to prove that the world isn't a nice place and that talking about hope is just for people who are weak. "You're telling me," the guest host continued, raising his voice so the whole audience could hear, "that you really believe all that stuff? That love conquers all?" He let out another mock laugh, shaking his head. He looked out at the audience, expecting them to laugh along with him. "Look, folks, I'm sure this sells movie tickets, but in the real world, being nice and having faith is just a good way to get trampled on. Nice guys finish last, right? That's how the saying goes." The audience didn't laugh. In fact, the room grew even quieter than before. People looked at each other with uncomfortable expressions. They could sense the cruelty in the guest host's voice. He wasn't just cracking a joke. He was trying to tear down something beautiful. He was mocking the very things that made Keanu who he was. He was making fun of the idea that a person could survive tragedy and still choose to be good. It felt like a bully kicking over someone's sandcastle just because he could. The guest host, sensing that the audience wasn't on his side, decided to double down. He didn't like that the room was on Keanu's side. He became more aggressive, his tone turning sharper. "Oh, don't give me those sad eyes," he sneered, pointing a finger at Keanu. "You're one of the richest actors in the world. You fly on private jets. What do you know about real pain? Save the tragic hero act for the screen. We get it, you're the internet's boyfriend. You're the good guy, but let's be real here. It's all an image, right? Just like everyone else in this town." He sat back, crossing his arms smugly, thinking he had dropped some kind of truth bomb. He looked at the main host, expecting a high five or a nod of agreement. But the main host just sat there, staring at his notes, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. The guest host had misread the room completely. He thought he was being the cool, realist voice in the room, but he actually just looked mean. He looked small next to Keanu's quiet dignity. Keanu shifted in his seat. He didn't look down at his hands. He didn't look away in shame. He kept his eyes on the man who was mocking him. There was no anger in his gaze, just a steady, calm observation. It was the look of someone who had seen real monsters in life and knew that a rude man on a talk show wasn't one of them. Keanu knew that the guest host's words weren't really about him. They were a reflection of the guest host's own unhappiness. Happy people don't mock kindness. Only people who are hurting inside try to drag others down to their level. The tension in the studio was unbearable now. The lights seemed to buzz louder in the silence. The producers in the control booth were likely panicking, wondering if they needed to cut to a commercial break or if the guest host was going to say something even worse. The audience members were holding their breath, waiting to see how Keanu would react. Most people would have yelled back. Most people would have walked off the stage. The insults were personal, and they were being broadcast to millions of people live, but the incredible thing was Keanu didn't flinch. He sat there, taking in the mockery. He allowed the negativity to wash over him without letting it stick. He listened to the cynicism and the bitterness, and he didn't fight it. He just waited. He knew that he didn't need to defend himself. He knew who he was. He knew what he had survived. He knew that his faith was real because it was the only thing that had gotten him through the darkest nights of his life. A sarcastic comment on a TV show couldn't touch that. The guest host, realizing that his verbal jabs weren't getting the reaction he wanted, let out an awkward chuckle and tried to make one more joke. All right, no more heavy stuff," he said, trying to lighten the mood he had destroyed. "Let's get back to the fake punching." He laughed again at his own joke, but it sounded hollow and nervous. He could feel the energy of the room turning against him. The air was thick with disappointment, directed not at Keanu, but at him. It was a critical moment. The story of the night had suddenly shifted. It wasn't about a movie star promoting a film anymore. It was about a battle of two different ways of living. On one side, there was the loud, cynical mocker who believed in nothing but making fun of others. On the other side, there was the quiet, humble man who believed in love and kindness. The whole world was watching to see which one was stronger. And just as the pressure seemed to reach its breaking point, Keanu opened his mouth to speak. The mocking laughter was about to be met with something far more powerful. The silence that followed the guest host's cruel attempt at a joke was heavier than anything the studio had ever heard before. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that seemed to press down on everyone's shoulders. Usually, when a comedian makes a joke on a live show, there is at least a polite chuckle from the audience, or the sound of a few people shifting in their seats. But this time, there was nothing. The room felt frozen. The guest host looked around, his smile starting to twitch at the corners. He had expected the crowd to side with him, to laugh at the idea of a famous actor being real. Instead, he was met with a wall of disapproval. You could practically feel the thousands of people in the audience, thinking the exact same thing. This isn't funny. The main host of the show looked visibly uncomfortable. He shuffled his papers and cleared his throat loudly, trying to break the tension that was now choking the air out of the studio. "Well," the main host started, his voice a bit shaky, "I think what we're trying to say is that Keanu here has a very unique perspective. A lot of people in Hollywood could learn from him." But the guest host wasn't done. He seemed to realize that he had lost the room, and his panic started to turn into desperation. Instead of stopping, he tried to double down, thinking that if he just pushed harder, he could turn it back around and make it look like he was the smart one in the group. He laughed again, but this time it sounded nervous and high-pitched, like a child who knows they are in trouble but keeps making noise anyway. "Come on, guys," he shouted to the audience, pointing at them with both hands. "Don't take everything so seriously. He's an actor. They pretend for a living. I'm just saying, let's not act like he's a guru sitting on a mountaintop. He's just a guy who got lucky in movies." He turned back to Keanu, leaning in aggressively, invading Keanu's personal space. "No offense, buddy, but the whole 'woe is me, I'm so spiritual' bit. It's a little old, isn't it?" The camera operators adjusted their lenses, zooming in tight on Keanu's face. This was the moment everyone was waiting for. They wanted to see the mask slip. They wanted to see the John Wick side of him come out. They wanted to see Keanu get angry, to stand up and yell, or to tell the host to shut up. That is the kind of drama that makes for good television. It's what people tune in for. But Keanu didn't do any of that. In fact, he barely moved. He just sat there, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He didn't look at the audience, and he didn't look at the main host. He kept his eyes fixed on the man who was mocking him. There was no hate in his gaze, which was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. He didn't look at the man like an enemy. He looked at him with a sense of pity. It was the look you give someone who is clearly hurting but doesn't know how to ask for help. It was a look of deep, sad understanding that the silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The guest host's smirk began to fade completely, replaced by a look of genuine confusion. He couldn't understand why his words weren't working. He realized that Keanu wasn't going to fight him. He wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of an argument. And because he wasn't getting that reaction, the guest host started to look smaller and smaller on that big couch. The giant lights above them seemed to shine only on Keanu now. Leaving the mocker in the shadows, you could see Keanu's mind working not out of anger, but out of thoughtfulness. He was choosing his next move carefully. He knew that millions of people were watching. He knew that there were probably people at home who were going through their own hard times. People who were being mocked or bullied or who felt like their faith wasn't worth holding on to. He knew he couldn't just explode. He had to show them a better way. Finally, the guest host sat back, defeated by the silence. He threw his hands up and let out a frustrated sigh. "Okay, fine," he muttered. "Let's just go to a commercial or something. This is painful." He looked at the main host, signaling for him to cut the segment. The tension in the room was unbearable. It was like watching a balloon expand until it was ready to pop. The producers in the control room were surely screaming into their headsets, their fingers hovering over the buttons that would fade to black. But just as the main host was opening his mouth to speak, to apologize and send the show to break, Keanu finally moved. He didn't stand up. He didn't wave his arms. He just leaned forward a few inches. This small movement caught everyone's attention instantly. The audience leaned forward in their seats. The cameramen forgot to blink. The main host stopped talking mid-sentence. Keanu didn't look at the floor. He didn't look nervous. He took a slow, deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was low and steady. It was the kind of voice that cuts through noise without needing to be loud. He addressed the guest host directly, but he spoke to the entire world. "Grief changes shape, but it never ends," Keanu said softly. The guest host rolled his eyes, ready to make another snarky comment. But Keanu held up a hand gently, palm outward. It wasn't a defensive move. It was a request for peace, a request to just let him finish. The guest host froze, his mouth half open. "People ask me how I keep going," Keanu continued, his tone getting warmer, like he was sharing a secret with a close friend. "And the truth is, the only way I know how to survive the dark days is by holding on to the light. You call it a routine. You call it an act. But for me and for millions of people watching, it's survival." He paused for a second, looking directly into the camera lens, making eye contact with the people at home. "I'd rather be naive and hopeful than right and bitter. Because if you lose your hope, you really have nothing left. No matter how much money you have or how famous you are, without kindness, you're just empty." The words hung in the air, simple and powerful. There was no fancy language, no Hollywood speechwriter tricks. It was just pure, honest truth. The guest host sat there, his face turning a shade of red. He looked like a child who had just been scolded by the school principal, but in the gentlest way possible. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He had no weapon left. Keanu had taken away his anger by refusing to fight back with fire. Instead, he had used water, quenching the flames before they could spread. The room was still quiet, but the feeling had completely changed. The heavy, suffocating tension was replaced by a sense of awe. The audience members looked at each other with wide eyes. They could feel something incredible about to happen. The mockery had backfired completely. By trying to humiliate Keanu, the host had accidentally given him the perfect platform to show the world what true strength looks like. Keanu wasn't just surviving the interview anymore. He was taking control of the narrative, one quiet word at a time. And the best part was, he was doing it with a kind of grace that no one could argue with. The guest host was about to learn a very public lesson about the power of dignity. The words "I'd rather be naive and hopeful than right and bitter" seemed to hang in the air like a soft melody long after Keanu stopped speaking. For a few seconds, nobody moved. It was as if the entire studio had collectively paused to process what they had just heard. The contrast was shocking. On one side, there was a loud, sarcastic man who had spent the last 10 minutes trying to tear people down to make himself look smart. On the other side, there was a quiet man who had just opened his heart and showed everyone that true strength comes from kindness, not from being clever or mean. The guest host sat frozen for a moment. His mouth was still slightly open from where he had intended to make another snarky comment, but the words had died in his throat. He looked at Keanu, and for the first time that night, he saw past the celebrity status. He saw a man who had lived through hell and come out the other side still believing in the good of humanity. The realization hit the guest host like a bucket of cold water. He suddenly understood that he wasn't in a comedy sketch anymore. He was in the presence of something real, and he had made the mistake of treating it like a joke. A look of panic flashed in his eyes. He tried to force a chuckle, wanting to say, "Okay, good point, let's move on." But the sound was strangled and awkward. It sounded pathetic, not funny. Then a sound came from the back of the studio. It was the sound of two hands clapping together. Then another pair. Then another. It started slowly, a rhythmic and steady clap that didn't feel like applause for a movie star. It felt like a salute to a warrior. It wasn't a polite golf clap. It was genuine. People were standing up. One by one, like a wave moving through the seats, the audience began to rise. The energy in the room shifted instantly from awkward tension to overwhelming support. The silence was broken not by laughter, but by the roar of people cheering for the man on the couch who had refused to be knocked down. The main host, seeing the transformation, quickly jumped on board. He realized that the narrative had completely flipped. He grabbed his cards and tossed them aside, leaning over to clap his hands together. He shouted into his microphone, That right there is what makes this man a legend." The crowd went even wilder. The cheering was so loud that the guest host had to shrink back into his seat, covering his ears slightly. He looked like a scolded child who had been sent to the corner while the rest of the class got ice cream. The cameras darted around the room, capturing the smiling faces of the audience, the relief on the main host's face, and the total embarrassment of the guest host. But the most incredible moment was yet to come. The focus zoomed back in on Keanu. How would he react? Most people in his position would have taken this moment to gloat. They would have smirked at the guy who mocked them, perhaps saying something like, "Who's laughing now?" or giving a smug nod to the crowd. It would have been understandable. After being insulted on live television, Keanu had every right to enjoy the fact that the crowd was now on his side. Instead, Keanu did something that left everyone stunned all over again. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the main host. He turned his body toward the guest host. The man who had mocked him was now sitting there, looking small and humiliated. The audience was booing the guest host, shouting things like, "Leave him alone!" or "You're the jerk." The air in the studio was turning hostile toward the mocker. Keanu could have easily let that happen. He could have let the crowd destroy the man, but Keanu leaned in closer to the guest host. The noise of the crowd was deafening, but Keanu spoke softly. The guest host looked up, expecting a rebuke. Instead, he saw Keanu smiling at him. It wasn't a fake Hollywood smile. It was a gentle, forgiving smile. Keanu reached out and patted the guest host on the shoulder. He leaned in and said something that only the two of them could hear. Later, people would speculate on what he said. Some thought he said, "It's okay, we all have bad days." Others thought he said, "I appreciate you pushing me." Whatever the words were, the effect was visible. The guest host's face softened. The defensiveness drained out of his posture, replaced by a look of genuine shame and maybe even a little bit of gratitude. By doing this, Keanu taught the audience a lesson they wouldn't forget. He showed them that you don't fight darkness with more darkness. You don't fight bullying by becoming a bully yourself. He turned a moment of humiliation into a moment of grace. He effectively disarmed the situation completely. If he had fought back, it would have been just another argument between two celebrities on TV. but by showing kindness to the person who was meanest to him, he won. He didn't just win the argument, he won the hearts of everyone watching. The cheering grew even louder when they saw the interaction on the couch. People realized they were witnessing something rare. We live in a world where everyone is ready to argue, ready to cancel someone, ready to fight. Seeing someone absorb the hit and respond with a hug or even just a kind word was powerful. It was a reminder that we don't have to be products of our environment. We don't have to be cynical just because the world is tough. We can choose to be better, the guest host, perhaps realizing he had been outclassed in every possible way, finally spoke into his microphone. He didn't try to make a joke. He didn't try to be sarcastic. He looked down at the floor and then back at Keanu. "You know," he said, his voice lacking its usual swagger, I guess I have a lot to learn about how to handle things." It wasn't a full apology, but coming from a man who built his career on never being wrong, it was a massive admission of defeat. Keanu just nodded, his face remaining calm and kind. He didn't rub it in. He simply accepted the moment. The main host, sensing that the magic of the moment was reaching its peak, signaled for the band to play them out. As the music started, a gentle, upbeat tune, the audience didn't stop clapping. Keanu stood up to leave. He didn't wave like a politician. He simply pressed his hands together in a prayer position and bowed slightly to the audience, a traditional gesture of respect. Then he turned to the guest host one last time, gave a small nod, and walked off the stage. The segment was over. The cameras stopped rolling, but the feeling in the room lingered. The guest host sat there for a moment, staring at the empty spot on the couch where Keanu had been. He looked like a man who had just stared into a mirror and didn't like what he saw, but who also knew that he had been given a chance to change. The crew bustled about, resetting for the next commercial, but the energy was different. It was lighter. It was hopeful. And it was all because one man decided that faith and kindness were worth more than winning an argument. The incredible turn wasn't that Keanu fought back and won. It was that he didn't fight at all and still won the room. As the bright red on-air sign finally flickered off, the studio didn't instantly snap back to its usual chaotic energy. Usually, as soon as the cameras stop, the crew rushes in to reset, people check their phones, and the buzzing noise of daily life returns. But this time was different. The studio remained unusually quiet for a long time. It was as if a ghost of something holy was still lingering in the air above the empty couch. The audience members didn't immediately stand up and file out toward the exits. Instead, many of them stayed in their seats, whispering to one another. They were trying to process what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just a TV segment for them anymore. It felt like they had been part of a real-life lesson. The guest host sat motionless on the couch. He was no longer leaning back with his arrogant smirk. In fact, he looked smaller than he had when the show started. He was staring blankly at the floor, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. The main host stood up and patted him on the back, a silent gesture of comfort, but even that felt awkward. The guest host didn't look up. He knew he had messed up, and not just in a small way. He had tried to punch up and missed, and in doing so, he had shown millions of people exactly who he was inside. The silence in the studio was louder than any booing crowd could have been. It was the sound of his own ego collapsing under the weight of reality. While the studio absorbed the shock, the world outside was already reacting. Within minutes of the interview ending, clips began to flood the internet. But it wasn't the usual clip of a celebrity promoting a movie. The viral videos weren't about the new action film or the stunts. They were titled things like, "Keanu Reeves shuts down," "Bully with Grace," or "The moment the world stopped listening to a cynic." The internet, which is usually a place full of arguments, anger, and negativity, suddenly seemed to unify. People who usually fought over politics or sports were sharing the same video, all saying the same thing. This is how you handle it. Comment sections, which are often wastelands of hate, filled up with stories. People wrote about their own grief, their own struggles with faith, and how seeing Keanu sit there and take the high road gave them the strength to keep going. They wrote that if a man who had lost so much could still be kind, then maybe they could too. The mockery that was supposed to make Keanu look weak had done the exact opposite. It had made him look like the strongest man in the world. He hadn't won a fight by punching harder. He had won by refusing to throw a punch at all. Back in the guest host's dressing room, the mood was heavy. He sat in front of a mirror, staring at his own reflection. He took out his phone and saw the notifications pouring in. They weren't nice. People were criticizing him, calling him out for his mean behavior. In the past, he might have laughed it off, written a sarcastic tweet, or played the victim. But tonight, he couldn't do it. He watched the clip of himself laughing at Keanu's pain, and then he watched Keanu's response. Seeing it from the outside, without the adrenaline of the live show, he realized how ugly his laughter had sounded. It wasn't funny. It was bitter. It was the sound of someone who had forgotten how to be happy for others. He realized that Keanu's naive faith was actually a superpower. Keanu didn't need to mock people to feel big. Keanu was solid in who he was. The guest host, for the first time in years, felt a deep sense of regret. He realized that being the cool guy who mocks everyone actually leaves you very alone. He saw that the kindness Keanu talked about wasn't an act. It was a survival tool. The guest host stood up and washed his face with cold water. He didn't know if he could ever change his personality completely, but he knew he couldn't go back to being the person he was on that couch 10 minutes ago. He picked up his phone and typed out a tweet. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame the script. He simply wrote, "I was wrong today. I have a lot to learn. Thank you, Keanu, for the class." Then he put the phone down and sat in the quiet, finally listening to the silence. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves had already left the building. He didn't go to an exclusive after-party. He didn't check his social media to see if he was trending. He walked out of the studio through a back exit, where a few security guards and a small group of fans were waiting. But he didn't act like a superstar who had just won the night. He stopped to sign every autograph. He took pictures with everyone who asked. When one fan told him, "You were amazing back there," Keanu just smiled that humble smile and said, "Thanks. Just trying to get through the day like everyone else." He got into his car, a modest vehicle compared to what he could afford, and drove off into the city night. He wasn't thinking about the guest host. He wasn't thinking about the ratings or the viral clip. He was probably just thinking about getting something to eat or calling a friend. He had shown up to the show to talk about a movie, but he had ended up doing something much more important. He had reminded the world that you don't have to fight fire with fire. You don't have to let the world turn you into something hard and cold. In the end, the incredible thing that happened wasn't a magical event or a sudden miracle. It was simply the power of human dignity. It was one man deciding that his peace was more important than a stranger's opinion. The guest host had tried to use Keanu as a punchline, but Keanu had refused to be a joke. By holding on to his faith and his kindness, he turned a moment of cruelty into a masterclass on how to live. The story of that night spread far and wide, not because of the conflict, but because of the resolution. It became a story people told their children, a story shared in classrooms and offices. It became a reminder that in a world where everyone is screaming to be heard, sometimes the loudest voice is the one that speaks softly and with love. The guest host would go back to his show, and cynicism would still exist in the world. But for anyone who watched that night, the standard had been raised. They had seen what true strength looked like, and it looked a lot like kindness.